Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide a smooth webinar. Our upcoming webinars are on July 25th with Sarah Stoddard. She'll be giving a presentation on why DNA for genealogists. And then that following week in August, we will have a webinar with Catherine Grant. I will send out emails with that new schedule for August, as well as post that to our social media and on our website as well. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. During the webinar, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. For today's webinar, we're pleased to hear from James Tanner. He'll be giving a presentation on the Ultimate Preservation Guide, the Ultimate Digital Preservation Guide. James Tanner has over 32 years of experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy's Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He has presented at expos and conferences around the US and Canada. He has served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving here at the BYU Family History Library. James has 7 children and 34 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. And if you'll just hold on just a minute, I can move over to James' presentation.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. Glad to be here for another BYU Family History Library webinar. Remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and published on our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com and type in BYU Family History Library, you'll find the YouTube channel. I think we're approaching 450 videos, and that's quite a bit. Today, we're going to talk about the Ultimate Digital Preservation Guide. And we'll move right along. Let's see if I have to, what do I have to click on to get this to move? Try that. Okay. One of the things that we have to be realistic about as genealogists and kind of embedding ourselves in the overall category of people interested in history and old things and old people and all different kinds of things like that, is that despite our best efforts, and no matter what we can do here on this earth, physical stuff basically decays. It can be destroyed or it can be lost in many different ways. Obviously, you could think of things out there that would not decay, like diamonds, for example, but ultimately even diamonds probably would decay. But it would be a little bit expensive to start inscribing all your documents and things on diamonds. I would think that wouldn't work too well. But anyway, what we've got out there is kind of a constant battle with decay, with things simply deteriorating around us. And kind of reminding everyone, there's about 25 million people die every day on the earth. So interestingly enough, and of those people, due to the loss or absence of historically valuable records, many of those people who die every year will disappear from the records that manage to be preserved. So we aren't doing too good a job of keeping up with the world population today as far as preserving information for future researchers. If we think about the past, then we can also think that there's a lot of records that have been lost over the years, many of which we probably never even knew about and never had any knowledge of, and some which we probably did. Interestingly, the cumulative cost of preserving a digital record is considerable and increases over time. So if we're thinking about trying to preserve information, basically, and we'll get to that in a moment, the idea that we can preserve the things that we're interested in by simply putting them on paper or publishing them in books or whatever form ignores some very basic things about books and paper and everything else that's gone on in the history of the world. So there is no way out of this system. I commonly talk to people about preservation and putting things and making sure that things are scanned and put on digital copies and things like that. And they say, oh, no, I don't trust that internet. I want everything on paper. I print everything off and keep it on paper. And my answer is, all you're doing is creating another type of preservation issue. You've moved from trying to preserve a digital file to preserving some other kind of information file, and it doesn't really solve the issue ultimately. All you do is just make some decisions that are based on a lack of wanting to preserve the information as completely as possible. Okay, so due to technical advances, we can now capture a much greater portion of our collective human history. We're not doing everything by any means, but we are amassing huge, unimaginably large amounts of information. And this information can be, will be able to be used in the future to reconstruct the lives of many of us. Right now, some of us, such as a person like me who spends a great deal of time online, my life could probably be reconstructed from the moment I got on the computer and had the internet until the moment we're sitting here today. But that's not going to be true about everyone, but it certainly advances a lot of people. Now, the cost of preserving one individual record has plummeted, and now is really down to close to zero. The cost of producing, of imaging one record it isn't even as much as picking people who fail to pick up pennies because they're not worth anything anymore. It's even much less than that. But the cost of preserving large numbers of records is still substantial. So depending on the number of records that you're trying to preserve, the cost of that preservation can grow extremely large, meaning into the millions or even billions of dollars of expenses on a national or international basis. Important to understand, and this is often overlooked by people who are urging everyone to get their documents scanned and digitized, is that digital stuff, along with everything else, all of the other what we call analog materials, that's paper and all of the other kinds of physical ways of recording information, from tape recorder tape to all sorts of other methods of recording information on CDs, CVDs, and things like that. The digital stuff will still decay. It'll be destroyed or lost, and there's lots of different ways that this can happen. And so when we're talking about preserving information and preserving these records, we need to be focused on the fact that a multi-media approach is probably the safest way to begin understanding how we're going to go about this preservation process. And let me kind of bring this home. What we're talking about here is the records that you personally have accumulated about you and your family and your ancestors. And perhaps those are unique records and perhaps not, but likely the ones that are personal to you and to your immediate family are less are more unique than the records about your ancestors at this point. By the way, the whole purpose of doing genealogy is to investigate historical records to find references to our ancestors. So if we were claiming that our ancestors, information about our ancestors was something unique, we would be ignoring the fact that we're actually finding that information from records that we personally did not create and we did not preserve and maintain. So it's a situation where we need to look at the records as information. And so the question comes up, what can we do? What do we need to do about this? Is there a need to do something? I can tell you right now that I have witnessed personally so many situations where there were lots of records. I was one a couple of years ago that was probably one of the most egregious situations that I found is one of the people that I knew casually said, "Oh, my mother just died and she was a genealogist and you're a genealogist and could you come over and tell us what we've got? We have no idea." In other words, here was the immediate family member and had no idea what the mother had done. Now that's one of the problems about preservation, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And that sharing the information so that other people in a sense, own that information and will not feel like it's someone else's problem or someone else's information. But in this case, I went to their home and I was taken into a good-sized room, a fairly large room. I would, estimate it to be maybe 10 by 20 or 12 by 20 foot room, fairly large. The entire walls were covered with bookcases. The room was almost completely filled with file cabinets. There were piles of records in every part of that room. There were probably hundreds of thousands of records in there, and some of which were probably unique. And these people had no idea what to do with it. They said, "Well, what are we supposed to do with all this stuff?" And so I spent a good hour and a half or two looking at the records and making recommendations and saying that these were very valuable and they should be digitized and they should be preserved. And some of these probably properly belonged in archives or special collections and libraries or in other places. And when we got through, they said, "Thank you very much." And that was the last I heard of it. And I can imagine that nothing happened. In other words, that those records were probably put in boxes and stuck someplace, and now they're probably been thrown away. So basically, we need to be proactive. We need to understand that this is not a isolated problem. It's a specific and personal problem to every genealogist who accumulates any significant amount of information, particularly if any of that information is unique to that individual, meaning diaries, journals, things that have been created one copy up of any kind of a document or record. So where do we start? What do we do when we want to start with this? The answer to this is we have to approach this in kind of a different way. You have to think of information rather than paper. The question here is, what do we learn from the document pile that we have here? Is there any information in there that is worth keeping or unique? Or are there any of these documents that have information plus the fact that they are historically interesting documents? Okay, so let me give you kind of a couple of examples here. A family group record that has been filled in with information about a family. That obviously piece of paper, that old family group record, I'm very sure that there are genealogists today who have never actually handled a family group record. They've never seen one. They've spent all their life online and they just simply don't know that there's paper that exists. Actually, on familysearch.org, which is the big family search website, if you do a search in their historical record collection, you'll find out that it just search for family. And what you'll find is that there are over 5 million digitized copies of family group records on that one website, on familysearch.org. And that's that 5 million copies of family group records on Family Search is just like the barest tip of the iceberg of all of the family group records that have been created on paper. But are these documents important historical documents? The answer is no. They are not important historical documents. Is the information helpful in historical? Yes. And the answer to that is some of it may be and some of it may not be. Some of it may not even be correct. Some of it may be duplicative. It is not necessarily the type of thing that we're worried about ultimately preserving. What would we do to preserve the records of all those historical records? Basically extract the information from all of those family group records and incorporate them into a database such as the Family Search family tree, and then all of that information is preserved and available. Is there a reason to keep the paper? There is always an argument that there is a reason to keep the paper. But the weakest of those arguments are that we may lose the digital copies and we need to keep the paper to back up our digital copies. The answer is it's the other way around. The digital copy is a backup for the paper, which will probably disappear at some point in time. A lot of the paper that was used in those for those records is already turning yellow and may very, very well not survive too many years longer. So what we need to do is kind of change the way we think about these. So when we have something like this family group record, we look at it and we see that it has a bunch of names and dates and some other things on it. And we understand that this document only has value as long as the information that's contained has not already been digitized and incorporated into an online database that will be preserved. And from that standpoint, it is very, very unlikely that once this information is available online and searchable online, that the information that's here will not be worth keeping. In other words, preserving this. And this would be doubly so if this were a copy of a family group record rather than an original typed record, where in this case it's typed, not handwritten. But if it were the original record, there may be some historical reason for keeping it, because if it were in handwriting, it may be in the handwriting of your grandparent or your great-grandparent or whatever, and you may want to preserve that. If it's a typed record, the question and the sort of threshold question here about preservation is how much of the content or information is already digitized and online. If it's there and it's already available, it's already been copied into, incorporated into family trees, and very likely useful. One thing about these records, though, these old family group records, and why they're on familysearch.org website in a digitized format, is because not all of the information on all of these records has been copied into the databases. So there's still a reason to go look at some of these, because there are sources and notes and other things that appear on these records that may provide additional information. So the main reason for keeping these records is to ensure that every last piece of information that can possibly be wrung out of these documents is available to get. Does the paper have an intrinsic value as paper? Well, it only has, once again, I'll repeat that because I think it's very important to understand, and that is the importance of the paper is based on the emotional connection to whatever and however it was created. So, for example, if I have the original handwritten diary or journal or life history of my ancestor, that is a valuable historical document. It should be preserved. If I have a copy of a copy of a copy of such a document, my copy of it should be made sure it was digitized and put into some record repository, but my copy is not as valuable as the original. So that's really some kind of a way to tell the difference between an intrinsic value. Now, let me mention, at this point, we mentioned photographs. A photograph by its nature is a unique document. Until we got into the world of digital photos, where no digital copy is unique, that it can be infinitely copied without any degradation of the original. Basically, the original photograph is now the only copy we have of that particular photograph. We can digitize that, in which case it is now preserved in a digital format, but we really should preserve the photographs. So there's not a, people ask me all the time, well, I've digitized all my photographs, so now what do I do with them? And I say, you maintain them, you keep them, because you do not, they are original and valuable, unique historical documents. So it's important that we do that. No matter how worthless you think the photographs are, they are still preserving some of our history and some of our background. Okay, now this is an important fact. This is something that I think everyone should repeat to themselves as they're digitizing their documents, and that is, just because something is digitized, it does not mean it is preserved. Digitization is a process of making a electronically readable digital copy, but it is not preservation. Preservation is the act of providing a way, a pathway into the future that the document or the electronic signal or whatever it is we're trying to preserve will be made available and preserved for the future. What's the cost of digital preservation? That is really an issue. I mentioned earlier that the cost of preserving one individual record today is not measurable in any monetary system. It's so small that no one would care. You would have to get into the thousands of documents, or tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands. Recently, for example, I've been receiving ads consistently about every day through the news stream. And in that, they have been telling me that the solid state drives, the solid SSD, solid state digital drives, are dropping in price, and that you can get a 128 gigabyte SSD for $5 or under $10. The price of some of these devices has dropped to the almost giveaway stage. They're really not have no real value anymore. And the cost of preserving huge amounts of information has fallen dramatically. Hard drives, for example, which are increasing in size and falling in price constantly because of the pressure from the solid state devices that will ultimately replace them, have become to the point where I can buy an 8 terabyte hard drive. Now, that's more information that most people in the world, probably, except for a very small, infinitesimally small percentage, would ever be able to create in their lifetime, to fill up an 8 terabyte drive. And you can buy an 8 terabyte drive right now for less than $150. And so the cost of each incremental piece of information that you put on one of those drives is not even measurable in our monetary system. So basically, this is the reason why digital preservation has become so important. And this is the cost. Here's the real cost, the back-end cost that it takes to preserve massive amounts of information. And first of all, there's the cost of the physical equipment. We think of preserving our data and we put it on a hard drive. Well, that's nice. That could happen, but basically all we've done is made a copy, and that copy may or may not be preserved unless we take some very specific steps to make sure that that information that you've now created on a hard drive or on a flash drive is now preserved. But the cost of the physical equipment to do this on a massive scale is significant. And we have out there what are called server farms, and these server farms run literally tens of thousands into the millions of hard drives. And they're what are out there storing and manipulating and using the data that we now see flowing around on what we call the internet. So that's the physical equipment costs money. Obviously, it costs to buy a scanner, it costs to buy a camera, it costs to buy a computer, it costs to buy hard drives, it costs to buy, even though they're very cheap, it's cost to buy SSD drives, flash drives, thumb drives, whatever you want to call them. Okay. The other great question out there is the file format. How are you going to keep these documents? The nature of the technology that we're using to what we call to work the digital universe out there, the internet that we call the internet, or we call the network of all of the computers in the world. Use specific file formats. I just had the experience recently, in the last couple of days, of a program that I purchased for a considerable amount of money a few years ago, came up and had error messages and basically stopped working. And the reason it stopped working was because the company that originally developed the program simply decided not to continue to update and upgrade the program. And that was about a year or two ago. And as a result, now because of operating system changes and upgrades of the computer, the program just simply stopped working. So it went off my computer. And had I used that to create a specific file format, then that would have been lost. So the question is the file format, and I could give some more examples, probably use up all our time talking about horror stories of losing files because the file format changes. The biggest problem I've had is doing that. The issue that we have here is called migration. What that means is that we move our files from one format to another, from one operating system to another, to keep them viable and keep them alive. And this is the migration part of it. So we have physical equipment, which, by the way, needs to be updated. And we have file formats, which need to be aware of, and we need to change our files to the most current format. And then we need to migrate those files to new devices. Okay, so let me give you kind of a concrete example. I use an iPhone, as many millions of other people in the world do. And it takes photographs. In fact, it takes very nice photographs, and I use it all the time to take photographs. That's my physical equipment, but I can assure, I am not only reasonably, I am constantly reminded that at the end of this year, they will come out with a new iPhone. And I am reminded that they will come out with one in 2020. And I am reminded that there'll probably be another one out in the next year after that. Okay, so the physical equipment is going to change constantly. And do I need to change my physical equipment? Well, Apple Computer just announced recently that they were discontinuing support for older iPhones. So now you have an iPhone that can't be necessarily, can't do what it was originally supposed to do, and that is interface with a network that has moved on to a different file format or a different way of taking documents. In Apple's situation, most of the old Apple computers, smartphones that were sold had cameras. All of them did, but the newer ones had better cameras. And with those cameras, you would take the standard JPEG photo. Well, a couple of years ago, Apple decided to change the file format. Now, if you take a photo with your iPhone, it comes out as an HEIC format file. Perhaps you haven't seen that, but if you look at the extension on your photos, you'll see that they come in a different format. What recognizes an HEIC? That's a real question. It's been a process over the last 2 years watching different companies adopt and recognize HEICs. But as a matter of fact, within the last day, I have tried to copy a iPhone direct download photo in HEIC format and could not open it with a specific program. I had to go to another program and transform that format into JPEG format in order to preserve the photo. And that whole issue of that is called migration. That's what we're doing. And then the biggest question of all is venue. And venue means, where are we going to store all this information? If it's sitting on your hard drive next to your computer or on the hard drive in your computer, then it will probably get lost. There's nothing you probably can do about it to keep it from getting lost if it's just going to sit there, because your computer is at some point in time going to stop working. And I've been working with this now pretty steadily for the last couple of weeks, last week or so, because one of my friends asked me if I could capture some audio off of an old tape, an audio reel-to-reel tape recorder. And I happen to have a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I was able to digitize the file, and then I was able to manipulate and change the file. So I've moved the venue of the information, or the audio file that was on that reel of tape, into a digital format. And now I can put that on a flash drive, and he can copy it to his computer, and it's preserved, and he can move it where he wants and gain access to it. While it was sitting on the reel-to-reel tape, it was not accessible. And so venue is very important. And in our case, we need to look for a venue. As genealogists, we need to look for a venue that has some believable ability to preserve the information that we store off into the future. Can we depend on a commercial corporation to do that for us? You still buying things at Sears? Are you any of you still out there can remember Montgomery Ward? Any of you want to try to get something personal, lately at any one of the large retailers? Well, you can see that venues can change very rapidly. And so that's the other program. Now, where do we go to get the information we need to know how to do most of these things? Where do we get into the stream of information about document preservation, of all kinds of digital preservation? Basically, there is one clearinghouse out there. It is the Library of Congress Preservation Directorate. It's on the Library of Congress website, and that is loc.gov, but it's a little bit hard to find. Like all big government websites in the United States, they're not really well organized and difficult to find things. So you probably are going to need to just do a search for preservation when you go to the Library of Congress website, loc.gov, type in preservation. You'll get the Preservation Directorate as one of the choices. In that, you will find extensive and exhaustive commentary, documents, and instructions on how to preserve everything from comic books to dresses, to clothing, to whatever. In other words, they have taken into account almost every kind of physical object, and incidentally, books and paper and everything else that goes along with it. So this is where you go. And the main guidelines for how this should be preserved is done by the federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative. It's called FADGI, and I would not venture to guess what how they call that, what they call that. But anyway, that is the place where you can look for, and if you do a search for federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative, you'll find the Library of Congress connection, and you will find a extensively detailed documents that describe every type of preservation standard for every type of material that's out there and what they need to preserve. So this is where it all is. This is the core of the preservation world that we come to. Now, my biggest problem is what I call the paywall. So we want you to be aware of the paywall. Now, what is a paywall? A paywall means that you are going to have to pay a periodic payment to use or access the information that you store. Okay, so I put it on the cloud, which we have as a euphemism for the internet. And we say, okay, it's out there stored on somebody's computer. Well, they're not going to do that for free forever. They're only going to do that as long as it's commercially viable, if they have some reason for it to do that. Unless they have a reason to make sure that it will always be free. Now, who out there would make sure it would always be free? Google, Microsoft, the commercial backup programs? No, those are all paywall programs. Those are people that want your money to preserve your information. There is really at the present time, and it's not free. We say that the program is free, and that's FamilySearch.org. FamilySearch will preserve genealogical information, photos, digital items, stories, audio files, all sorts of information free, meaning there is no paywall, meaning you do not have to pay to get access this. And as far as it's ever going to be possible on this world to have any assurance, they will not charge any further payments for using their website for storage. But you still have to pay to get an internet connection to get on the internet. Maybe. Today, not so much. Before it was really a big digital divide between people who could afford to get internet connections and those who couldn't. Today, Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi connections are ubiquitous. They're all over, every place. There's hardly any store or anything that I can go in that I can't get, quote, free Wi-Fi connections. So libraries, all sorts of institutions now have Wi-Fi connection ability. So getting onto the internet is not always now can encounter a paywall, but preserving information on the internet usually does, except for a very, very few exceptions out there. So what happens when you die? This is the ultimate question. When I go out to do conferences and presentations around the genealogical community, I come to the unstartling realization that most of us are a little older than other people generally that you see. And so what happens when we all pass away? Well, that's really should be a very good concern. And when we're talking about preservation, it doesn't make any sense to digitize all the documents, spend the hours to digitize everything, put it on a hard drive, and then forget about it and die. Don't do that. Keep from dying until you get this stuff put into a position where you can actually use it and think that it's going to be preserved long term. Okay, so the first question that comes up, I've said this, I don't know how many thousands of times, literally, and had people come back to me almost like automatic and say, well, I'm just going to put it all in a book and then I'm going to give it to my kids. So we're going to have a book published with all of the information that I have accumulated over the year. Good. All you've done there is put it into a different venue, and The paper book will disappear along with everything else. So we really haven't planned too long term. We may have pushed it down the road a few years, but once you have looked at all of the literally tens of thousands of personally published genealogical books that I've examined, we had a huge collection at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library in Mesa until it was disbanded and torn down. But those books are still available. They're now probably mostly sitting in the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. But they're all being digitized, and they're going to be put in storage because the cost of having a book out on a shelf prohibits the having every kind of book in the world sitting out on the shelf. So if you look on FamilySearch.org and you go to the search tab and you find that there is a book collection, you'll find that there's hundreds of thousands of those books that have now been digitized. So ultimately, they could be preserved on the Family Search website, but on the other hand, they could have gone directly to a digital copy and uploaded to the website. They would have cut out all the expense of having lovely books sit around. So this is kind of the information that you need to look at it. You're not really solving the problem. You're just moving it into a different venue. So the question is, should I use a scanner or should I use a camera? And this was a hot topic for me for about, I'm going to say about 20 years or so. Scanners were developing in technology. They reached a kind of a plateau where they are more than adequate resolution and everything to take archive quality digital copies of flat documents that you can put in a flatbed scanner. But many things aren't too flat, and we'd like to photograph them. Books are difficult to scan on a flatbed scanner without cutting them apart and putting the pages together. And on the other hand, there are ways there are book scanners out there. There's all sorts of ways to do that. The issue here with scanning is we have to worry about resolution. Well, we had this discussion within the past couple of weeks at length with a very sincere genealogist who was concerned about it. Basically, I went to the Library of Congress, the digital preservation part of the Library of Congress. We looked at the guidelines and the standards for digitization for archive purposes at the National Archives, et cetera, that the Library of Congress puts down in the United States. And there were two resolutions mentioned. One was 300 dots per inch, or DPI, which is now a meaningless reservation, but it's generally accepted to everyone understands what it is that has been involved with digital preservation. And the other was 400 DPI. So there's really not high resolution content, depends on the nature of the object. Most text documents with lines on paper or typing or printing on paper, 300 DPI is sufficient. And that's all you need. But up to 600 DPI for photos. Once you go above that, you can go out to 2,500 or 3,000 or 4,000 DPI or whatever they advertise now with scanners. But all you're really doing is increasing the size of the image. You're not really increasing the resolution of the details in the image. So there's a difference there. And so basically, you can pop it up to whatever you want to, whatever resolution you want to. What about the difference between using a scanner for flat documents and photos and a lower resolution handheld device like a smartphone? Well, lower resolution is acceptable for text documents, but it probably is not going to do well on a camera for duplicating a photograph. A scanner will give you a much higher resolution. So the question all along, and what I spent years doing, was I would take as new cameras came out, as I got higher pixel counts in the cameras, and I got different cameras and migrating through cameras, I would take a photograph that was had good contrast and was in good had been well taken and was focused correctly. And then I would take it and scan it on a flat bed scanner at a reasonably high resolution. And then I would look at the digital file, and then I would take a picture of the same photo with the camera, with a series of cameras over the years. And I was always come out with the fact that the flat bed scanner was superior to the cameras, period. No question. So then the next step was camera technology kept increasing. The amount of digital resolution of the cameras increased. When did it cross the threshold? Well, for documents, 300 DPI didn't really do you much. You could go as high as you wanted to. You have a document and you scan it at 2400 DPI or whatever the count is on your scanner, and then you look at it on your screen. You're not going to see much difference at all. You can just keep going up to 5,000 if you wanted to, and it would still, all you're going to do is have a bigger file and a bigger file and a bigger file. Once you hit the range of 300 DPI, you have basically hit the optical resolution of your eyes, as a matter of fact. So going higher is not going to do you a whole lot of good. But the big question is, how are you going to save these documents? So you go to the documents, and you have a lot of different types of ways. We have three different formats here listed on the screen: JPEGs, which are the most common, TIFFs, which are not so common, and PDFs. There's a lot of other different file formats out there, and I already mentioned probably all I'm going to say about file formatting. That will change, and there will be new file formats. Presently, all three of these formats are accepted by the Library of Congress as officially acceptable. So, high resolution for photos and other physical items, how high do we have to go? This is basically the threshold. Cameras did not equal flatbed scanners until they reached 20 megapixels in resolution. So if you are using a camera like an iPhone or an Android phone or some other one of the various brands of cameras out there, it is not going to give you archive quality resolution. It's acceptable. It would work well for text. It will not work well for digitizing photographs. You really have to have a camera that has more than 20 megapixels of resolution before it will equal a flatbed scanner. That's just the way it is. How many cameras out there now have 20 megapixels? How much do they cost? You can buy a very, very good 20 megapixel plus camera for $500. So it's not like you have to go to the $3,000 or $6,000 cameras or $50,000 cameras or whatever to do it. And so what do they use for professional archiving? We did professional archiving last year for Family Search at the Maryland State Archives for a year, and we used 50 megapixel cameras, just to know what it is. If you want to go out and buy a 50 megapixel camera, you can buy a 50 megapixel Nikon or Canon camera, and they'll run you roughly $3,500, maybe $4,000, between that range. Where do we store the digital copies? This is the venue issue. The word venue means place. And so the place where we're going to store these, where are the digital copies going to go? The issues are local versus remote. Are we going to store everything locally on our computer, or are we going to put it someplace? Well, the answer is both. You're going to do both if you want to have digital preservation. If you want to make sure that the files aren't lost or destroyed, you're going to have some local storage, and you're going to have backup remote storage. I presently use 4 different 8 terabyte drives to back up my main computer, one of which does a complete snapshot of everything on my computer and internal hard drive about every half hour. The others are backup for all the documents and all the photos and everything else that I produce. And then everything, including everything on the external hard drives, is backed up continually to a cloud service. And so basically, you can look around and decide which one you think is most profitable, the most reasonable and price-wise and reliable. And there are many, many different backup possibilities there. All of this depends on the quantity of information that you have. If everything you have in your storage that you've created and all the photographs you have and everything can fit on a flash drive, you basically have no problem. You're going to be able to store that for pennies, maybe even free. But there's more to that than just simply moving it out there. Here we are back to dying. And so the question is, how do we transcend death? What do we do when we die? The answer is we need to get sure that the information and the original documents that are worth preserving are donated or given to someone or some organization that will preserve them. We have lots of organizations like this in the United States. We have libraries with special collections. We have archives. We have historical societies. We have all sorts of organizations and things out there that will keep information for indefinite periods of time. The issue here is, do they want it? And the answer to that is usually no. Put everything online. Well, yes, and I think I've mentioned and probably beating it to death that I would recommend Family Search as the put everything online place. If you don't like that, at least put them all on Family Search and then put it someplace else if you wish. You just have to understand that your descendants, your people who inherit your stuff, may not want to spend any money on Ancestry or whatever other program that you've managed to put your information in. They may not want to upgrade your desktop program. And so you're just basically gambling on the fact that they may or may not accept everything. One way to do it is put everything in a funded trust. Go into fund a trust for preservation and get a trustee, write a ironclad legal document and require that all your information and all your documents be preserved for the rest of the eternity. If they have enough money to do that, they'll pretty well do that. Likely, if you have things that are that important, they'll probably be better preserved in an archive or in a special collections library, unless you want to build your own climatically controlled storage location. So really the chance you have of preserving your information is most likely to happen with multiple copies on multiple venues. So once you have all this stuff digitized, you make a lot of different copies on different things, hard drives, on the network, you upload it to Family Search, you upload it to other programs, you put as many copies out there of your information that you can possibly do. And that it will give you a greater assurance that the information that you have is possible. So here's Family Search, and we use a free online permanent storage venue like Family Search, which is familysearch.org. And that is probably the best bet you have today. Summary. Okay, here we are. What are we going to do with this? Number one, we're going to digitize everything. Everything. We have to decide whether we're going to keep it or whether it's worth digitizing. That you can, wring your hands over that for a long time. But the idea is just digitize everything. Don't worry about whether or not you think it's worth keeping. Then back it all up. Make sure that everything's backed up on multiple external hard drives, on online backup services, on uploaded to whatever, so that all that digitized work is preserved. Then make sure you migrate it regularly. Make sure it keeps working, even though it be that you change operating systems or you buy a new computer or you go through the process. You have to do that. And any of the services like Family Search that are going to preserve documents and things like that are going to have to do the same process. They're going to have to migrate that as the operating systems and file formats change. And then share. This is probably the most important of all. Share this. Make sure that your children, your grandchildren, your whoever, your siblings, whoever is going to survive you, understands and appreciates the importance of the work that you've done, and will buy into it. Will have an ownership interest in making sure that the information is preserved. That's probably the best way of all of getting all this information preserved. Worrying about organization, this is kind of my parting comment. I have so many people who say, yeah, I would like to digitize it, but I've got to organize it all first. And my answer is no, don't do that. Don't wait. Scan it, photograph it, do all the digitizing first, then worry about organizing it, because then we've captured it all and we're not going to be spending our lives and we're, on our deathbed. Oh, I didn't get it organized. Well, forget it. Just get it all scanned. And then we can piecemeal work on organizing it however you want to be it organized. But basically let the computer organize it. And we've got a couple of videos on the BYU Family History Library web YouTube channel about organization, and I won't get into that today. But there's plenty of ways to look at organizing the information. One thing that you might take a little question about is I call this the ultimate digital preservation guide. And on Genealogy Star on my blog, I am continuing to write on this topic and I have no end in sight. So if you need more information, simply go to my blog, which is Genealogy Star, or https, etc., /genealogystar.blogspot.com. And then you can see as this ultimate digital preservation guide gets into part 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever, until you're very tired of it, and then you can stop reading it. Well, that's what we have for today. Thank you very much for watching, and remember that these webinars are uploaded and digitally preserved on our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel and on the BYU Family History Library website, which is part of the Brigham Young University Harold B. Lee Library here at BYU. Thanks for watching today.
All right, the chat box is open now for questions. If you have any comments or questions, I can read those out while James is still here. I'll keep that chat box open in case anyone has a question, but for now I'll just move over to the closing announcements. Next Thursday at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, we'll be having our webinar with Sarah Stoddard on why DNA for genealogists. And Sarah will be following up with more DNA webinars. I know that that's been a hot topic for a while, and we have some more presenters that have an expertise in that area. So be sure to watch out for that. The recording of this webinar will be available next week and will be posted on our YouTube page and on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can email me at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or visit our website, which is fh.lib.byu.edu. We hope that you have a great weekend, and thank you so much for joining us.